Hi, my name is Scott, and in this video, I'm going to talk about an argument that I think is going to be really popular on the 2022 LD topic about universal healthcare called circumvention. And I'm going to break down exactly what circumvention is, how it's going to be used on the healthcare topic, why I think it's such a good argument on this specific topic, and how affirmative teams and negative teams trying to deal with circumvention might answer this argument on this resolution. So, what is circumvention? I thought this would be a good place to start because if you're watching this video, this could seem a little progressive or high-tech or really advanced to start, and it's really not. And I wanted to start by breaking down what exactly circumvention is. Pretty simply put, circumvention is a type of solvency argument that says that the affirmative or the plan won't fully work as expected. Essentially, the processes of bureaucracy, the processes of government that exist will in some way, shape, or form inhibit the full solvency of the affirmative in the debate. In simpler terms, you could just think of this as like a policy happens, in some way, people won't comply, they'll get around the policy, they'll cheat, they'll ignore the rules are inept at dealing with how the modern day does with it, there's loopholes, it can be repealed, the legislation can be refused to enforced by another branch or by the branch that passed it itself. It can be rolled back. And this isn't specific to legislation. It's just specific to how the government and the processes of bureaucracy work. And a lot of times I see this on international topics where it's like, you can't force this country to follow along or this country destroys the process. Well, this isn't true on our topic. I think that this healthcare topic is going to be really good for circumvention. And I think that on a base level that there's some real world truth to circumvention as an argument in government and bureaucracy because it does exist. So like, unmonitored funding programs, unfunded mandates, other things like this have a historical precedent for, what debate would call circumvention existing in the real world. And I think that if you're following up-to-date politics, that in the healthcare legislation that was just passed, that the insulin part of that bill is a pretty good example of it. But I'll talk about that next in the healthcare section. So hopefully this was a good explainer of what exactly circumvention is. And now I want to start to talk about circumvention on the healthcare topic. So I think healthcare is really prone to circumvention arguments. And I think that this is true when you look at the history of healthcare in the United States, specifically with Obamacare or ACA, the Affordable Care Act. So if we look at circumvention specifically on the healthcare topic, the first thing that strikes me is there was legislation literally named repeal and replace that failed to pass by one McCain vote of the thumbs down that Trump mocked and was very unhappy with, that, the ACA legislation, Obamacare, almost was taken off the table completely and repealed by Congress, and there was only one vote that saved that. So potentially, a repeal type of circumvention argument might be based in the literature, and I think why circumvention is really good on this topic. There's all sorts of other countless examples with ACA dealing with the Supreme Court as well. I think that there's two big examples that I can think of. The first one is the 2014 case of Burwell versus Hobby Lobby, often just called Hobby Lobby, where the ACA's contraceptive mandate was ruled to violate corporations' rights to freedom. So, there's historical precedent of even components of the ACA being repealed or being ruled unconstitutional. And this is also true in the second instance, where in 2012, in the National Federation of Independent Businesses versus Sept, the Supreme Court upheld the individual mandate. Sept was Obama's Secretary of Health and Human Services, and a group of businesses sued them to say the individual mandate component of the ACA is not legal under the Constitution, shouldn't be constitutional. Leading up into the, I believe it was a 5-4 Supreme Court decision, 75% of people thought that the individual mandate was going to get overturned and wiped out. Fortunately, in my opinion, it was upheld, and the individual mandate is still a thing to today. But that is another great example of an instance where circumvention at a federal level definitely could exist. So Congress, in the repeal and replace, Supreme Court in both of these cases, great examples of circumvention in the real world. I think that if you look into the federal district courts, that there's also going to be a lot of examples of circumvention where federal district courts have ruled components to healthcare or ACA unconstitutional, but that's probably outside the scope of this video. I do want to go back to Congress for a second, because anybody who's following the current Congress's bills, legislation, what they're doing. There was just a piece of legislation passed that had an insulin cap of $35. So anybody who bought insulin, the maximum they would be allowed to be charged would be $35. And that passed, but then there was some loophole or something that happened that fits in with this circumvention argument, that they essentially just wrote off that whole section, and now insulin can be whatever price it is in the open free market economy rather than being capped. And I think that that is something that circumvention debaters are also definitely going to want to look into. I think that the next area is probably going to be one of the most prevalent areas to look at circumvention on the healthcare topic, and that is the states. And I think that there's a great precedent with this, and I think it's probably going to go in conjunction with the state's counterplan, going to be abusive. You can think what you want about that, but 12 years later, after ACA, right? 12 years to, not to the day, but around 12 years, there's still a dozen states that refuse the ACA's Medicaid expansion, which includes Texas, which is the second most populous state and the most populous Republican historically voting state. So if we look at this, there might also be a lot of precedents. Sure, the federal government could do something, but the states aren't going to follow through and do what the federal government wants it to do. So I think these are all examples on the healthcare topic. There's just easy arguments to make, and I don't think that these arguments are super progressive arguments that are going to be made in plan, etc. debates. I think that these arguments are just core to the topic literature that anybody from, your local regional circuit to, the finals of a major national TOC bid distributing tournament could say, because they're really core substantively to the topic. Obviously, there's going to be lots of other ways that you can think about, but hopefully this was a good thought-invoking discussion of what circumvention might look like on the healthcare topic. Now I want to talk about why I think circumvention is different on this topic. So if you've made it this far, you're probably like, oh, Scott, people say circumvention on every topic. It's wanky, wah. I don't generally disagree. I'm not the biggest circumvention fan. But I think on this topic in particular, that circumvention is really good. The first reason that I think that circumvention is really good is just there's a ton of literature on it. There's so many cards. I have run into to a dozen cards in the last 3 days researching this topic that you could classify as, B+ to S+ pieces of evidence on circumvention. And I don't think that that's true on other topics where you're more based on debaters sort of winging it analytically. The other reason that I think that circumvention is different on this topic is it's just core to the topic. The way the process works, it's in the literature, there's an empirical precedent for it. It interacts with all of the advantages, actors, the mechanics to how solvency and how affirmatives are going to work, the counter plans. And, don't forget, it's a solvency argument in its roots. So circumvention is meant to take out the solvency to the affirmative. So it's going to interact really well with a lot of the solvency mechs to affirmatives. And even like K teams would be really well off to make these arguments, because mitigating the case is super useful in every instance, or in almost every instance, in those types of debates as well. And I also think what makes it different on this topic is it's not just a progressive argument. So circumvention is historically something you'd make in front of a really experienced judge, former national type competitor who knows what's going on. And I don't think this is the case on this topic, just because at a fundamental level, it makes sense. And at a regional and local level, I think a lot of those judges, especially in regions that don't have as progressive as debate, will understand these non-enforcement arguments, especially at the state level, very, very well. So that's why I think circumvention is going to be read on this topic. Now, how do you deal with it? I've explained why I think this argument's great. It's great on this topic. I generally don't think it's great, but how do you deal with circumvention? Couple ways. The first way that you can deal with circumvention is cards. I already mentioned there's tons of cards on this. You can probably put Control F circumvention into the college wiki. There'll be a bunch of stuff. You should cut new cards. Don't rely on the college wiki. But if you want to, those things exist. You should just create some circumvention cards. If you don't want to do that, the second way and most common way that people normally deal with circumvention is this argument called durable fiat. Durable fiat. And the notion of durable fiat is kind of the notion that I'd say most people think that durable fiat is the notion that the affirmative sort of passes with 100% certainty, and that the affirmative should be the best model of the affirmative. It's essentially just like a more specific model of fiat to try to deal with things in different manners. I'm going to talk about more what this means in a second, but essentially it's a more strategic or excessive use of fiat that allows people to say, fiat means that we are this but isn't this. So an example of that would be like the Riders DA that people have historically read. You could say, something will be a rider on the affirmative, and the affirmative could say, no, we fiat there's no riders because that's how it happens, because we're the affirmative and that's what we get to say. We get to say how the affirmative works. Is that really how it works? Is that how sort of the quote unquote magical powers of fiat works, right? Is this really can you just fiat out of every solvency argument that ever exists? That doesn't sound fair to me. That doesn't sound like what durable fiat should be. So I would say that durable fiat is more just saying, some specific version of fiat that is sort of a middle ground between the most and the least restrictive versions of fiat. So, for instance, should the affirmative have to deal with arguments about it being struck down or roll back? No, the affirmative should probably get to fiat through those things. Should the affirmative have to answer arguments about the affirmative will be poorly enforced? Absolutely. The affirmative can't durable fiat and say no, we fiat, it's good enforcement. No, that's not a thing. They definitely have to answer that, which is why I think durable fiat is more a question of the least versus the most restrictive notions of fiat and whether or not that's good or bad for debate. Durable fiat. A couple other ways that you could deal with circumvention. A solvency mechanism. I think a lot of people will build in a specific way that their solvency mechanism works, but not choose their whole AF. over this. I think that a great example of this is federal key warrants. If you're interested in what that means, you can look at the domestic video that I put out. But I think specifically where I've seen this in the past is when people have read single agent AFs to try to get out of circumvention. And I think the best example of this is probably like a military AF, because the military would just do it and it would it would circumvent. It would kind of get out of the normal processes that an affirmative would go to. So I would think traditionally, maybe teams that don't want to deal with circumvention might go to the military, or different actors like that. I think that the last way that you can think about is just like different plan text mechanisms that, might be cheating, might be abusive, might not be. But I think that, back in my day, there used to be plan text where people would put like funding and enforcement are guaranteed at the end of the plan text. I think you could see people doing that on this topic, or different components of their solvency text to try to deal with this. Like, the affirmative won't be rolled back. The states will follow along with it. Sort of the same way that the Lopez counterplan devolves federal powers, gives them to the state, and then the state does that thing. I think that you might see some component of texts do this on the affirmative side on this topic to try to deal with some of these circumvention arguments, to like try to force the states to do it, follow along, different things like that. So hopefully this video was helpful, walked you through what circumvention is, why I think it's a really good argument on this topic, and how to answer it. So I will see you next time. Bye.